howls across the desert. The sands shift like whispers of forgotten souls. A woman walks alone, barefoot, trembling, her child crying in her arms. No home, no water, no name that history wished to remember. Yet heaven watched her. And in that barren wasteland, she became the first human to see God and live. They called her Hagar, the slave who defied despair, the mother whose tears turned into mercy. But how did a servant cast into exile become a vessel of divine vision? Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. And if stories like this one move your heart, make sure to subscribe. Imagine standing beneath a sky so vast, so silent, that even your heartbeat feels like thunder. The sands stretch endlessly, golden and cruel, and every breath you take burns with the taste of survival. This was not a battlefield, not a palace, but the desert, a place where God speaks through emptiness. And somewhere within that desolation walked a woman history often calls a servant, but heaven called by name, Hagar. Her story lies hidden between the lines of Genesis, often overshadowed by the grandeur of Abraham and the promise to Sarah. Yet if you look closely, beyond the verses of inheritance and prophecy, you will find a tale of a woman's heartbreak, faith, and divine encounter so powerful that it changed the course of spiritual history. Hagar was not born of privilege or covenant. She was a foreigner, an Egyptian servant brought into Abraham's household, part of the wealth acquired during his time in Egypt. In a world ruled by lineage and bloodlines, she was invisible, but the invisible often become the vessels of revelation. When Sarah, Abraham's wife, could not conceive, she made a decision that would echo across centuries. She gave Hagar to Abraham, hoping the child born through her would fulfill God's promise, and thus Hagar conceived Ishmael, the son who would become both a blessing and a mystery, whose descendants would span nations. But joy quickly turned to bitterness. Jealousy crept into the tent. Sarah's heart hardened, and Hagar's womb, once praised, became her curse. The scriptures tell us that Hagar fled into the wilderness, running from her mistress's cruelty. Alone, pregnant, frightened. It was there, near a spring of water, that something extraordinary happened. For the first time in recorded scripture, a divine being appeared not to a patriarch, not to a prophet, but to a runaway slave woman. The angel of the Lord spoke to her, called her by name, and told her that her son would be great, a wild man whose hand would be against all and yet blessed beyond measure. In that moment, Hagar named the place Bir-lahai-roi, the well of the living one who sees me. Her eyes had seen the unseen. Her soul touched eternity in the midst of despair, but this was only the beginning. For years later, after Isaac was born to Sarah, Hagar's place once again became uncertain. The covenant child had come, and Ishmael, now a growing boy, was no longer welcome. Sarah demanded their exile. Abraham's heart broke, but he obeyed. At dawn, he sent Hagar and Ishmael into the desert with a skin of water and a piece of bread. Imagine that moment. A mother walking away, her son silent beside her, the horizon stretching endlessly forward. The sun climbing higher, the heat devouring all hope. The water ran out. The child wept. And Hagar, unable to bear his cries, placed him under a bush and walked away, just far enough not to hear his dying breath. She wept, but her tears did not fall unnoticed. For the second time, heaven spoke to her, not through wrath or command, but through mercy. The angel said, "Do not be afraid, for God has heard the boy crying." And then the miracle. Her eyes were opened, and she saw a well of water, the first oasis of divine mercy. It is said that her tears became the well that never ran dry, and that from that place began a lineage that would one day shape nations. Yet how many truly understand what Hagar's story reveals about the nature of God? In the vast silence of the wilderness, God did not appear to kings or prophets, but to an outcast mother, a woman discarded by men, but chosen by heaven. Hers is not merely a story of survival, but of revelation, of how divine compassion transcends social order, race, and bloodline. But what if I told you? The truth was hidden in plain sight all along, that the desert where she cried still holds echoes of that divine encounter, and that her lineage carries a prophecy many have overlooked for thousands of years. The story of Hagar does not begin in the tent of Abraham, but far beyond the lands of Canaan, where the Nile's waters once nourished empires, and pharaohs ruled beneath the blazing Egyptian sun. She was born in a world of gods carved in stone and kings who claimed divinity, where slaves were nameless and dreams belonged only to the free. No scripture tells us who her parents were. No genealogy records her birth. Yet silence in scripture often hides the greatest truths. Legends among early Jewish and Islamic scholars whisper that Hagar may have once been of noble blood, perhaps even a handmaiden in Pharaoh's court. Some claim she was given to Abraham and Sarah after the plague struck Egypt, a gift of atonement for Pharaoh's transgression when he took Sarah into his palace. If those whispers are true, then imagine the fall. A young woman of refinement suddenly reduced to servitude, carried across sands into a foreign land, bound to a new master's household. Every sunset she would have watched the dunes of Egypt vanish behind her, wondering if the God of her new masters was different from the gods of her homeland, or if he was simply stronger. In Abraham's camp, life was both humble and holy. The tents stretched like shadows beneath the sky, each one glowing faintly with the firelight of evening. There were herds to tend, prayers to utter, and travelers to feed. Abraham's people lived by faith in promises unseen, wandering toward a destiny spoken by a voice only he had heard. Hagar, quiet and observant, must have listened from a distance. She saw how Abraham would leave the tent at night to look at the stars, as if counting his hopes among them. She saw Sarah's sorrow too, the silent ache of a woman who could not give birth. Hagar might have pitied her mistress, yet she also would have known the cruelty that sorrow can breed. In ancient customs, a barren wife could offer her servant to her husband to bear a child on her behalf. It was not love, it was law, but law can wound as deeply as sin. One night, perhaps under the same stars that Abraham once counted, Sarah called for Hagar. Her tone may have been gentle or cold. "Go into my husband," she said. "Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And so, without choice, without voice, Hagar became a vessel for someone else's hope. In time, she conceived. The camp rejoiced, or pretended to. Abraham, though conflicted, thanked God for the promise of a child. Yet within Sarah's tent, shadows grew darker. Jealousy has no need for words. It lingers in glances in the silence between two women who share one man and one impossible destiny. Hagar, carrying the life within her, began to feel a strange power rise. For the first time, she was no longer invisible. Her body carried the heir to God's chosen servant. And somewhere deep within her heart, pride flickered, a fragile flame of dignity that had been long denied. Perhaps she walked with her head higher, or her eyes lingered too long on Sarah's face. Perhaps she smiled when she shouldn't have. Whatever it was, it ignited fury. Sarah struck her. Whether with words or with hand, we do not know. The Bible only says, Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her face. And so began one of the most haunting journeys in all of Scripture. The desert awaited, merciless, vast, and indifferent. The path from Hebron to Shur stretched like a corridor of death. Hagar, pregnant and alone, walked until her legs gave way, until her voice became a whisper swallowed by the wind. The sun above her was merciless. The sand beneath her burned like judgment. Each breath was a prayer she did not know how to form. And then, near a spring of water, she collapsed. The sound of running water was like the heartbeat of creation. She leaned over the pool, her reflection rippling in the surface, broken, trembling, lost. That was when the silence broke. "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" The voice was gentle, not thunderous. It did not come from above, but from within the stillness. She looked up and saw him, the angel of the Lord. He stood not as a vision of terror, but of light veiled in tenderness. His eyes reflected eternity, and in that moment, the desert ceased to be empty. "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai," she whispered. Then came the words that would echo through the ages. "Return to your mistress and submit to her. For I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be numbered for multitude." He spoke of her unborn son. "You shall call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction." Ishmael. The name itself was prophecy. God hears. Tears filled her eyes, not of sorrow but awe. She realized she was not forgotten. Even in exile, God had seen her. A slave, a foreigner, a woman without power, and yet the divine had spoken her name. "Have I truly seen the one who sees me?" She breathed. and she named the well Bir Lahai Roy, the well of the living one who sees me. That moment became eternal. In the desert where the world saw a fugitive, heaven saw faith. When Hagar returned, she carried more than a child, she carried revelation. Perhaps Sarah looked upon her and felt fear she could not explain. Perhaps Abraham saw in her eyes the reflection of something divine. Whatever they saw, it was enough to keep her near until Ishmael was born. Years passed and the boy grew strong. His laughter filled the camp. His presence reminded Abraham that God's promise could take flesh. But the promise of God does not always follow human plans. When Sarah finally conceived and bore Isaac, the air in the camp changed again. The tent seemed smaller. The laughter of two children clashed like echoes in a narrow room. Sarah's joy turned possessive. Her faith mingled with insecurity, and Hagar once again became a shadow, this time in the presence of two heirs. One afternoon, perhaps during a feast, Sarah saw Ishmael playing. The sight pierced her like a thorn. Fear whispered that the firstborn might someday claim what was meant for her son. So she went to Abraham and said the words that would tear his heart apart. "Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, with Isaac." Abraham was torn between love and obedience. He rose early the next morning, perhaps before the camp stirred, and called for Hagar. The air was cold, the dawn silent. In his hands he carried a skin of water and a small bundle of bread. His eyes were heavy with sorrow. "Take the boy," he said softly. "God will be with you." She looked at him, perhaps hoping he would change his mind. But faith often demands what love cannot bear. She took Ishmael's hand and turned toward the wilderness. The sands awaited again, the same desert where she had once seen the angel. The journey was long, the sun merciless. The water soon ran out. Her son, weak and faint, staggered beside her. Every step felt like a memory of despair. Finally, when strength left them both, she laid the boy beneath a shrub and walked a bowshot away. "I cannot watch the boy die," she wept. Her sobs blended with the wind until heaven itself seemed to mourn. And then, the silence broke again. "Hagar, what troubles you? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy where he is." The words came like water to the soul. She lifted her eyes, and there, shimmering in the heat, was a well. Not a mirage, not a dream, a real flowing spring. She ran, filled the skin with water, and gave it to her son. Ishmael drank, and life returned to his eyes. That well was not new. It had been there all along. Yet she could not see it until God opened her eyes. Such is the nature of divine mercy. It often waits unseen until tears make it visible. From that moment, Ishmael grew and became a strong man. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his descendants would form tribes that roamed the desert for generations. Tribes that would carry the memory of that spring as sacred inheritance. Hagar's story did not end there. Some traditions say she returned to Egypt to find a wife for Ishmael. Others whisper she lived out her days near that same well, the one that bore her name, the well of the living one who sees me. But in truth, her legacy was already written in water and wind. She had seen God and survived. She had learned that divine sight does not belong only to prophets and kings. It belongs also to those who weep alone in deserts. The sands of time buried her footsteps, yet her story flows through the veins of history like an underground river. Quiet, persistent, eternal. And somewhere in that wilderness, where her tears once fell, the wind still carries her name. For the desert remembers, and that's when the prophecy began to unfold. The wilderness of Paran was vast, untamed, and holy in its silence. For Hagar, the days after deliverance were not merely survival, they were a lesson in faith. The well that God had shown her became her sanctuary. Its water reflected the stars she had once thought were beyond her reach. Every drop was a reminder that she had not been abandoned. Yet the wilderness is never without its trials. The silence that once comforted her began to whisper questions. Questions that echoed through the chambers of her soul. Why had she been chosen to suffer? Why did divine mercy come through pain? And what was the purpose of her son's destiny? The one spoken by the angel. He shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. The prophecy haunted her. It was both blessing and burden. She saw the fire in Ishmael's eyes, fierce, proud, unbroken, and sometimes feared what he might become. In the nights when the wind screamed through the desert rocks, Hagar would gather driftwood and light a small fire. She would sit across from her son, watching the flames dance like restless spirits. "Do you know what your name means?" she would ask softly. He would nod. "It means God hears." "Yes," she whispered. "He hears the cries of those who are forgotten. Never forget that." But Ishmael was growing into a man of the desert, sharp-eyed, strong, and impatient with the memories of servitude. The wilderness made him wild, just as the angel had foretold. He learned to hunt, to track, to fight the winds that erased footprints before dawn. He was his mother's pride, and her greatest test. Years passed, and the memory of Abraham's tent became a fading echo. Yet sometimes, at the edges of dreams, Hagar would see his face, sorrowful, tender, unresolved. Did he ever think of them? Did Sarah's jealousy still cast its shadow over his heart? She could not know. But the conflict that had once been domestic was now cosmic. For Hagar's exile had not merely divided one family, it had split destinies. From Isaac would come Israel, the chosen people. From Ishmael would rise nations that would wander deserts, following the same God by another name. The world did not yet know it, but the first great fracture of faith had begun. One night, as Hagar lay by the well, a storm gathered in the distance. The wind roared like the voice of judgment, and lightning tore through the horizon. Ishmael, now nearly grown, came running toward her. "Mother," he called, "the storm is coming from the south and where the caravans travel." She rose to her feet. In the distance, the sand rose like a wave of darkness, and through the storm came the faint sound of hooves. Travelers. As the storm passed, the silhouettes of men appeared, desert traders weary and cautious. Among them was an elder who carried the mark of Egypt on his brow. Hagar watched from a distance as they approached the well, seeking water. When they saw her, they greeted her in the ancient tongue of her youth. "Peace upon you, woman of the well." Her heart trembled. "And peace upon you, traveler." "From where do you come?" "From Egypt," the man replied. "From the city by the river. We have heard of this place, the spring that never runs dry. They say a spirit guards it." Hagar smiled faintly. "Perhaps the spirit you seek is only mercy." The elder studied her. "Your face, it bears the memory of our land. What is your name?" "Hagar," she said. The man's eyes widened. "The Egyptian? The handmaiden of Abraham?" At the mention of that name, time seemed to stop. Ishmael stiffened beside her. "You know my father?" he asked. "Every tribe knows Abraham," the man said reverently. "His God is mighty. His descendants are said to inherit the earth." Hagar's heart ached. "And what of those he cast away?" The elder hesitated, lowering his gaze. "Even those, perhaps, are remembered." That night, as the travelers rested by the fire, Hagar listened to their stories. Tales of Abraham's growing wealth, of Isaac's birth, of the covenant renewed. Each word was a blade. The life she had left behind had flourished without her. Yet she felt no hatred, only a hollow ache, the ache of being both remembered and forgotten. When the travelers departed, they left behind more than gifts. They left knowledge, a reminder of the world beyond her exile. Hagar realized that her story was not finished. Her son's future was tied to nations yet unborn, but destiny often awakens conflict long before fulfillment. One morning, Ishmael found a wounded gazelle near the well. He tended to it carefully, binding its leg with a strip of linen. "Even the desert spares what it can," he said. But later that week, when a group of passing hunters demanded the creature for their feast, Ishmael refused. They drew their blades. The fight was swift and brutal. The hunters fled, but one fell beneath Ishmael's hand. Hagar watched in horror as her son returned, blood upon his tunic. "They would have killed me," he said, his voice trembling. "I only defended what was mine." What was his? That phrase lingered like a shadow. From that day, Ishmael's eyes carried a storm. He began to wander further from the well, chasing horizons drawn by something even he could not name. Hagar prayed. She prayed to the God who had once found her in the desert, begging for peace to fill her son's heart. But peace is not easily granted to those destined to shape history. One night, when the stars burned white against the black sky, Ishmael returned with strangers, desert tribesmen who had seen his strength and sought his leadership. "They call me brother," he said proudly. "They say I'm like the desert hawk, born to command, not to serve." Hagar looked at him. the child she had once placed under a bush to die. Now a man with fire in his voice and freedom in his stride. "My son," she whispered, "never forget who gave you breath. Not me, not Abraham, but the one who heard you cry." He nodded, but the restlessness in his eyes betrayed him. He belonged to the wild now. In the years that followed, Ishmael became a leader among nomads, a warrior, a hunter, a man whose name echoed through the sands. Tribes gathered under his banner, bound not by blood but by survival, and though he was far from his mother, the well she had once named still sustained him. But the conflict of their story was far greater than one family. For even as Hagar aged, her heart still carried a question that haunted her dreams. Why had God chosen suffering as the path to revelation? One night she woke to the sound of footsteps outside her tent. The desert was quiet, the moon full. She stepped outside and saw a man standing by the well, cloaked, radiant, familiar. It was the same presence she had seen years ago, the angel of the Lord. Her breath caught. "Have you come again to speak to me?" He did not answer with words, but with silence that hummed like creation itself. The wind around her shifted. The stars pulsed. And then she heard within her heart, "The son you bore will not be forgotten. His hand shall rise against nations, and his name shall endure. From his line shall come one who will bring the sound of submission to the winds." The word struck her like thunder. She did not fully understand, but deep within she knew this was no curse. It was promise. Hagar fell to her knees. The desert around her glowed faintly, as if the earth itself had remembered her tears. She realized then that her story, the pain, the exile, the silence, was not punishment. It was preparation. The conflict had never been between Sarah and Hagar, nor between Isaac and Ishmael. It was between the seen and the unseen, the chosen and the forgotten, the human plan and the divine will. As dawn broke, the angel's presence faded, leaving only the whisper of wind and the gleam of the well. Hagar knelt by its waters once more, her reflection steady this time. She was no longer the weeping servant. She was the mother of nations. The conflict, she understood now, was necessary, because without pain, mercy cannot be revealed. Without exile, faith cannot be born. And far away, beyond mountains and borders, the lineage of Isaac was growing, unaware that in the desert, another covenant had already begun to breathe. And that's when the revelation began to stir in the silence of the sands. The years turned like pages in an ancient scroll, each one written by the wind. The desert remembered everything, every prayer, every tear, every whisper between mother and son. But what the world had forgotten, heaven had not. The story of Hagar and Ishmael was still being written, not in ink or stone, but in the rhythm of the shifting sands. Hagar, now older and marked by the sun, had learned to live between silence and prophecy. The well that once saved her life had become her altar. Travelers came from far and wide to drink from its waters, calling it blessed, calling her the mother of the desert. But there was something deeper in her eyes, a peace that came only from one who had seen God, not once but twice, and lived to remember. She knew that divine revelation was not a single event. It unfolded slowly like the dawn over the dunes, and one night, as the stars burned white and the air trembled with stillness, the revelation she had long waited for came again. The vision began in silence. Hagar felt the desert's breath pause. The air thickened. Her heart began to pound, not from fear but from recognition. Then she heard it. The same voice that had called her years ago by the spring on the road to Shur. "Hagar," the voice said. She lifted her head. The night sky shimmered and a soft light descended over the well. The angel of the Lord stood before her again, radiant, patient, eternal. His eyes carried both sorrow and hope, as if he bore the weight of generations yet unborn. "Hagar, the one who was seen," he said, his voice like the hum of wind through the stones. "Do you still remember the promise?" Her voice trembled. "Yes, you said my son would be made into a great nation." He nodded. "And so he shall. But what you did not see then, you will see now. The wilderness was not your punishment. It was your preparation. For those who are cast out often become the first to see what others are too proud to behold." The light around him deepened, and suddenly Hagar saw, not with her eyes, but with her spirit. Before her stretched a vision of the future, endless tribes moving through the deserts, their banners lifted against the sun. She saw cities of white stone and golden domes rising where once only sand had been. She saw caravans crossing the ancient roads, bearing the name of Ishmael like a sacred echo. And then she saw something greater, a single light rising above all the rest. A man standing upon a mountain, his face turned toward heaven, proclaiming the same truth she had once whispered by the well. There is no God but God. Tears filled her eyes. Who is he? She asked. The angel smiled. He will come from the line of your son, a messenger who will remind the world of the one who hears. Through him mercy will once again flow like water in the wilderness. Hagar fell to her knees. The desert around her seemed to breathe, the sand moving as if alive. The angel's words sank into her soul like fire and rain. She realized then that her suffering had not been forgotten. It had been woven into the very fabric of divine history. For the first time, she understood that Ishmael's wildness was not rebellion. It was freedom. His restlessness was not sin. It was the call of destiny. Through him, nations would rise, and through those nations faith would be renewed. The angel lifted his hand, and the vision faded. You were never forsaken, Hagar. You were chosen to see God in a place where no one expected him to dwell. In exile, in hunger, in despair. You were the first to know that his mercy is not bound to temples or tribes. It flows like hidden water beneath every desert of the human heart. Then he was gone. Only the stars remained. Hagar sat by the well until dawn, her tears glistening in the early light. She looked at the water, her reflection trembling in its surface. You are the living one who sees me, she whispered again, and I am the one who saw you. That day she told Ishmael of the vision. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable, his eyes reflecting the flames of the fire between them. So our exile was destiny, he said finally. Not curse. Yes, she replied. The desert that took everything from us gave us something greater. Revelation. Remember that, my son. When the world forgets your name, heaven still speaks it. Ishmael nodded slowly. He had grown into a man who carried both the tenderness of his mother and the unyielding strength of the desert. His hands were rough from labor, his heart sharpened by solitude. But in his mother's words, he heard something eternal. In the following years, Ishmael's people multiplied. The wilderness became their inheritance, the stars their witnesses. The tribes of Nebaioth, Kedar, and Adbeel carried his blood and his legend. Their songs told of a woman who had seen God and of a well that had never dried. But revelation is never only about the past. It always points forward, toward something still hidden. One night, as Hagar rested beneath the stars, she dreamt again. The well glowed faintly beside her, and in its reflection she saw two rivers flowing from one source. One was clear, the other stormy, yet both moved toward the same horizon. She saw two nations, one from Isaac, one from Ishmael, destined to struggle, to misunderstand, to mirror each other in both faith and pride. She saw war and peace, envy and brotherhood, division and reunion, and through it all she heard the same divine whisper. Even in conflict I am present. Even in division I am one. She woke with tears on her face. The vision was both a warning and a promise. The children of Isaac and the children of Ishmael would walk parallel paths, sometimes in light, sometimes in shadow, but both beneath the gaze of the same God. Hagar's body grew frail, but her spirit only deepened. She became a figure of mystery among the tribes, the woman who had seen the invisible. People came to her not for water, but for wisdom. They would ask, "Mother of the desert, where can one find the living God?" And she would answer, "Where you think he is not." The revelation had changed her. She no longer feared suffering, for she saw it as a veil, thin, temporary, sacred. She understood now that pain was often the language through which God spoke most clearly. In the final years of her life, she lived in quiet solitude near the well, surrounded by her descendants. The desert, once her enemy, had become her companion. Its winds were her prayers, its stars her congregation. She would often look toward the horizon and whisper the name that had saved her. Ishmael. For in that name was the story of every lost soul, the assurance that no cry goes unheard. When the end came, it came gently. The morning was still. The well reflected the sky perfectly and blue, unbroken. Hagar sat beside it, her hands resting in her lap. She closed her eyes and smiled, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. And just before her breath faded, those who stood nearby said they heard a sound, like the soft rustle of wings, or the echo of her first encounter in the wilderness. The wind carried her final words. "He sees me still." The desert fell silent, but the silence was not empty. It was full of revelation, the truth that the divine does not only dwell in sanctuaries or within chosen nations, but also in the wilderness beside the exiled, among the brokenhearted, and somewhere in the unseen where eternity folds into time. A voice whispered again, the same voice that had called her long ago by the spring. "Your tears are remembered. Your story will endure." And that's when the hidden truth began to shine through history like light beneath the sand, waiting for those with faith enough to uncover it. The years that followed Hagar's revelation were both golden and shadowed, for even divine promises must pass through trials. Ishmael's tribe had grown strong. They had tamed the wilderness, drawing life from the land where none thought life possible. They built tents that gleamed like bronze under the sun, and their flocks multiplied like the stars that watched over them. Yet with prosperity came pride, the quiet, creeping pride that blinds even the faithful. Ishmael's men began to boast that they were the chosen of the desert, untouchable, destined to rise above all others. The songs that once praised God's mercy now praised their own strength. Hagar watched this change like one watching a storm gather on the horizon. Her son was no longer the boy who once wept in her arms by the dying sands. He had become a leader, fierce, confident, respected, but something in his eyes had hardened. One evening she called him to the well. The sun was setting, casting fire over the dunes. The air was still except for the cry of a distant hawk. "My son," she said softly, "you have become a man of renown. Nations bow before your name. But remember, the same God who lifted us from despair can humble us again if we forget him." Ishmael turned his gaze toward the fading light. "Mother," he said, his tone both respectful and weary, "I do not forget, but I must lead men who understand only strength. If I show weakness, they will turn away." Hagar shook her head. "Humility is not weakness. It is remembrance. Do not let your crown become heavier than your faith." He smiled faintly as if indulging an old story. "The world is not as it was when we walked alone in the wilderness, Mother. The tribes listen to power now. The world honors those who conquer." Her eyes darkened. "Then the world will soon forget who sustains it." Their silence stretched long into the evening, and though they sat beside the same well that had once saved them, a quiet distance grew between them, not of love lost, but of paths diverging. That night Hagar prayed beneath the stars, her hands trembling. "O Lord who sees me," she whispered, "let not the promise you gave us turn to dust through pride. Remind my son that all kingdoms fade but yours." It was the last prayer she ever spoke aloud. For the very next morning, Ishmael's scouts returned from the north with troubling news. The descendants of Isaac were moving closer to their lands. Rumors spread that a border skirmish had erupted. The two lines of Abraham, once bound by blood, now stood on the edge of hostility. The desert that once united them would soon divide them. Ishmael's pride swelled. "Let them come," he said. "If they claim the land, they will find we are not the wandering outcasts they remember. We are sons of the promise too." Hagar's heart sank. She saw the shadow forming, not merely a conflict of land, but of faith. The two rivers she had seen in her vision were beginning to rage against each other. In the following months, the tension turned to open conflict. There were no great wars, only whispers, skirmishes, and bitterness that spread from campfire to campfire. Ishmael's men spoke of vengeance. They saw themselves as the wronged, the forgotten sons, and Hagar, the woman who once carried revelation in her heart, now carried grief. The desert grew harsher that year. Wells began to dry. Flocks weakened. Sandstorms swept across the land with a fury unseen in generations. It was as if the earth itself was warning them, or mourning them. One storm in particular struck with apocalyptic force. It came suddenly, a wall of wind and sand that swallowed everything in sight. Hagar's tribe scrambled to secure their tents, but the storm roared like judgment. The sky turned red. The air itself screamed. Ishmael rushed to his mother's tent, shielding his face from the sand. Inside he found her praying, her silver hair whipping around her face like a halo of dust. "Mother, come," he shouted. "We must take shelter near the rocks." But she did not move. Her eyes were fixed on something unseen. "It is not the wind we must fear, my son," she said. "It is what it carries." "What do you mean?" Her voice was steady, calm, almost resigned. "The storm is not sent to destroy us, but to remind us." "Do you not feel it? The same hand that once opened this well now warns you not to build your throne upon the sand." Ishmael hesitated, torn between his duty as a leader and the haunting truth in her words. Then lightning split the sky, striking near the well. The ground trembled. Hagar gasped and clutched her chest. "Mother!" Ishmael cried, rushing to her side. Her breathing grew shallow. "The promise was never about land," she whispered. "It was about faith. Remember that, Ishmael. Remember." Her hand slipped from his grasp. The storm outside raged, but within the tent a sacred stillness fell. The woman who had once been seen by God had now returned to him. Ishmael held her lifeless body, his tears mixing with the dust. For the first time since his youth, he cried not as a leader but as a son. The desert roared in mourning, the wind keening like a lament. When the storm finally passed, the world was changed. The tents were half buried. The well's mouth was sealed by drifting sand. And beside it, Ishmael buried his mother, the mother of the desert, the seer of the living God. He marked her grave with stones and knelt before it, his heart heavy. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I forgot the promise." And then he did something that no one had seen him do in years. He wept until the stars faded. But even in death, Hagar's influence did not vanish. That night, as Ishmael slept beside her grave, he dreamt of her once more. She stood beside the same well, radiant, calm, her eyes clear as dawn. "My son," she said gently, "you cannot undo pride with sorrow. You must return to the place where it began, the well of life. Uncover it and remember." He woke with the first light of morning. The sand still lay thick, but he began to dig. His men watched in silence as their leader, the mighty Ishmael, clawed through the earth with his bare hands. Hours passed. His fingers bled. Still, he dug. And then, water. A thin stream first, then a rush bursting forth from the ground. The men gasped. The well was alive again. Ishmael fell to his knees, his tears mingling with the water. He drank, and for the first time, he felt peace. The well was no longer just a memory of survival, it was redemption. He gathered his people and spoke. "We are not the forsaken, we are the reminded. Our strength does not come from the desert, it comes from the one who made it." From that day on, the tribes of Ishmael honored the well not as a monument of pride but as a covenant of mercy. They named it again Be'er Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. And so through death came renewal, through loss came remembrance, through the fall of pride came the return of faith. Hagar's name became legend, not merely as the slave who bore Abraham's son, but as the woman who taught the desert to pray. And Ishmael, once the wild son, became the keeper of her legacy, his heart forever marked by the storm that took her and the water that redeemed him. The fall had broken them, but it had also brought them back to the truth Hagar had always known, that even in the wilderness, God still sees. The desert never forgets. It remembers every footprint, every tear, every prayer whispered into its winds. And long after Hagar's body returned to dust, her story lived on, carried in the breath of the dunes, in the songs of wandering tribes, in the blood of nations yet unborn. Ishmael, once a prince of pride, became a man of reflection. The storm that had taken his mother had also stripped away his arrogance. He no longer spoke with the tone of conquest, but with the humility of a pilgrim. His tribe noticed it first, the way he rose before dawn to pray, facing the horizon where light first touched the sand. He often stood by his mother's grave, his shadow stretching across the stones, whispering words that only heaven could hear. The once restless warrior now spoke softly of faith, mercy, and the God who sees. The desert that once mirrored his wildness now mirrored his peace. Years passed, and Ishmael's sons grew in number. 12 mighty leaders, the beginnings of nations foretold by the angel. They were strong, proud, and untamed like the wind itself. And yet, in their father's eyes, they saw something greater than strength. They saw remembrance. He taught them not of vengeance but of gratitude. We are born of exile, he would say, but exile is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of revelation. Every year when the sun reached its fiercest, Ishmael gathered his sons beside the sacred well. They drank together, in silence, honoring the woman who had once wept for them. Around the water's edge they placed 12 stones, one for each tribe, one for each promise fulfilled. The well glimmered under the scorching light like a mirror of heaven itself. One night as Ishmael sat alone by the water, an old traveler approached. His cloak was torn, his eyes weary from the road. "Peace upon you, son of the desert," the stranger said. "And peace upon you, traveler," Ishmael replied. "Come, rest by the well. Drink, for this water has seen sorrow and mercy alike." The man drank deeply, then looked into Ishmael's face. "Do you know who first gave this water life?" "I do," Ishmael said. "It was my mother's tears." The stranger nodded slowly. "And do you know what those tears have become?" Ishmael frowned. "They became this well. They saved us." The stranger smiled faintly. "No, they became a covenant, one that still flows through the veins of men. Wherever there is despair, the living one still sees. Wherever there is thirst, mercy still rises from the sand." And with that, the stranger vanished into the dark, leaving behind only the faint scent of myrrh and wind. That night, Ishmael dreamt again. He saw a figure robed in light standing beside the well. The figure's voice echoed like the music of eternity. "Your mother's faith has become the foundation of nations. Her suffering was not in vain. From her humility, the world will one day remember that God's sight is not bound by lineage, nor his mercy limited by rank. The tears of the servant have written the map of destiny." When Ishmael awoke, the first rays of dawn had touched the horizon. He bowed deeply toward the light, his heart trembling with awe. From that day onward, he dedicated his life to building not kingdoms of sand, but altars of remembrance. Wherever his tribes traveled, they dug wells and named them after his mother. Hagar's water, the seer's spring, the mother's tears. And in time, travelers began to tell stories of a woman whose eyes had met the divine in the desert. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, languages changed, scrolls were written and rewritten. Yet the story of Hagar endured, carried across borders, preserved in scripture, whispered in prayer. In the Torah, she remained the woman who saw God and lived. In the Bible, she became a symbol of divine mercy that reaches even those cast aside. In the Quran, she was Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, the one whose desperate search for water became an act of worship. Her footsteps between the hills of Safa and Marwa still retraced by millions in the holy pilgrimage to this day. Her well, known to the faithful as Zamzam, continues to flow, a spring born of a mother's tears, a testament that faith once tested can outlive the ages. So the story did not end in the desert. It never does. For what is faith, if not the ability to see light in the emptiness? Even now, when the wind moves through the valleys of Arabia, it carries the echo of her prayer. You can almost hear it if you listen closely, the trembling voice of a woman who once said, "You are the God who sees me." And perhaps that is her greatest legacy. Not the water, not the lineage, not even the nations that sprang from her son, but the truth that no one is ever unseen. Not the servant, not the sinner, not the forgotten. In her story lies a secret that the world still needs to remember. Divine mercy is not reserved for kings or prophets. It finds those who weep alone in the wilderness, those whose names history tries to erase. Hagar's journey began in bondage and ended in revelation. She was cast away, yet she became the first to name God not by title or tradition, but by encounter. She saw and was seen. And so her story continues, not in temples or scrolls, but in every heart that has ever felt abandoned, every soul that has wandered through its own desert and still dared to hope. When you walk through your own wilderness, remember her. When you feel unseen, remember her. When your faith trembles under the weight of silence, remember her. For somewhere in the depths of your despair, a well waits to be uncovered. The same eternal well that began with her tears. And perhaps in that moment of surrender you will feel what Hagar felt in the desert, the gaze of the living one upon you, gentle, unwavering, eternal. Her story, hidden in the sands of time, is not about exile. It is about encounter. It is about the moment the forgotten became the chosen. It is about the eyes of heaven that see not the crown but the cry. The desert keeps her secret still, but those who listen with faith can hear it whisper through the wind. I am the God who sees you. The desert stands silent. The same desert where Hagar once wept now lies beneath centuries of sun and wind. But beneath its surface something eternal stirs. Every grain of sand holds memory. Every breath of wind carries a whisper. She was seen. And now, at the edge of time, her revelation still unfolds. It is said that when Hagar named God El Roi, the God who sees me, she did something no prophet, no patriarch, no priest had ever dared. She gave a name to the divine not out of power or ritual, but out of intimacy. She didn't speak to him through sacrifice or altar. She spoke from her tears, and heaven answered. Think about that for a moment. A woman the world called a slave was the first to define God in personal terms, not as a distant ruler, but as one who sees. Her cry redefined the relationship between heaven and humanity. Before commandments, before covenants, before king, there was sight. The divine gaze that reached into human suffering and said, "You are not invisible." That single act reshaped the spiritual DNA of the world. For from her son Ishmael would rise nations that worship the one God. From Isaac, her counterpart's son, would come Israel, and through him the prophets. Both streams of the children of the promise and the children of the exile flowed from the same well of mercy. Two rivers, one source, and perhaps that is the secret hidden in the desert. That divine mercy was never exclusive. It was never about chosen against the forgotten, and it was always about the God who sees all. The world divided their lineages, but heaven never divided its sight. When the angel told Hagar that Ishmael's hand would be against all men, and all men's hands against him, it wasn't a curse. It was a prophecy. That his descendants would always challenge the arrogance of the powerful, that their voice would rise whenever the world forgot compassion. And through them, the remembrance of the living God would never fade. Thousands of years later, when pilgrims walk between the hills of Safa and Marwa, retracing the footsteps of a mother searching desperately for water, they are walking inside that revelation. What began as despair became devotion. What began as exile became worship. In that moment, the wilderness of Hagar became the birthplace of faith itself, not faith in comfort or covenant, but in mercy found through suffering. And here lies the divine paradox. Hagar, the servant, met God not in a temple but in the wasteland, not in abundance but in emptiness. The desert in its silence became a cathedral, and her tears, the first prayers ever answered by sight alone. But there is more hidden beneath her story, is a warning to every generation that follows. Hagar's name means flight or stranger. Her life is a mirror of humanity's endless running, away from pain, from guilt, from divine truth. Yet every flight leads us back to the same question. Who sees me? And the answer remains unchanged. When the prophets walked the earth, when kings built temples, when empires rose and crumbled, the echo of her encounter remained. Because her story is not bound to time. It is not ancient history. It is prophecy disguised as memory. In every age, humanity repeats her path, cast out by its own pride, wandering through deserts of its own making, searching for the water it already holds within. The well of Hagar is not merely a spring in the sand. It is the symbol of divine presence that never leaves, even when we do. The living one who sees us does not reside in temples or scrolls. He waits by the well where despair ends and revelation begins. Some say the location of her well still pulses with divine energy. Pilgrims who drink from it speak of a strange peace, as if the water remembers. Others say the spring was not just physical, but spiritual, a gate between worlds, where the divine compassion once touched human sorrow and sanctified it forever. Even now, the sands shift, revealing fragments of ancient stone, markings in forgotten tongues that speak of a woman seen by the divine. Archaeologists find symbols of eyes carved into stones, the sign of being seen. Some dismiss it as myth, others feel the truth in their bones. The story of Hagar, then, is not just history, it is humanity's reflection. For who among us has not walked through their own desert believing they are unseen? Who has not cried out thinking heaven silent, and yet it was in the silence that she was heard? It is here that the revelation deepens. Perhaps Hagar's encounter was never meant for her alone. Perhaps it was for all who would ever walk through despair and mistake it for abandonment. Her well was not just water for her child. It was water for all generations, an eternal symbol that mercy waits even in the dry places of the soul. And if we listen closely, her voice still speaks, not from the past, but from the spirit that lives in every heart that refuses to give up. He sees you. Those 3 words are the essence of every sacred text, every prophecy, every miracle, that no matter how far you have fallen, no matter how lost you have wandered, you are not unseen. The revelation of Hagar was not the appearance of an angel, and it was the awakening of humanity's awareness that God's vision reaches, even into despair. In that instant when she saw the divine, a mirror formed between heaven and earth. God saw her suffering, and she saw God seeing. The infinite and the mortal locked eyes through tears, and history changed. Her tears became the world's reminder that pain is not the absence of God, but often the moment when he draws closest. And so, when the scriptures say that the angel told her, "Fear not, for God has heard the boy's cry," it was not only Ishmael's cry that reached heaven, it was every mother's cry, every servant's cry, every forgotten soul that has ever knelt beneath a silent sky and asked, "Do you still see me?" The answer was spoken once in the desert, and it has never changed. Yes. It is said that at the end of time, when all things return to their origin, the well of Hagar will flow again, not from the earth but from within the human heart. For every soul that remembers compassion, every eye that looks upon another with mercy, draws from that same eternal spring. Perhaps that is the true miracle. Not that water sprang from the ground, but that faith sprang from pain. Hagar's revelation was not meant to be locked in history books. It was meant to awaken us, to remind us that divine sight is not a gift for the worthy. It is the inheritance of the broken. She walked through exile, but found eternity. She wept in despair, but gave birth to hope. She was unseen by the world, but seen by the one who made it. And so her story ends, not with silence, but with sight. In the endless expanse of the desert, where human footsteps fade and wind erases all memory, one truth remains carved into eternity. There is a God who sees. The desert has long been a place where faith is tested, a vast silence where every human illusion falls away, and only truth remains. Hagar's journey did not end at the oasis, nor at Ishmael's laughter echoing through the barren valleys. It continued in the unseen, in the bloodline that stretched across time, in the prayers whispered by her descendants, in the call of the faithful that still rises from the sand she once crossed with trembling feet. Hagar, a name once spoken with pity, now carries the resonance of divine purpose. She was not merely a slave who fled. She was a woman who saw. She saw the God who sees all. When everyone else turned their faces away, Sarah in jealousy, Abraham in sorrow, the world in silence, God turned toward her. That single gesture changed eternity. It is said that the desert remembers tears. The well of Zamzam, still flowing after thousands of years, is more than a spring. It is the memory of divine mercy. When Hagar ran between Safa and Marwa searching for water, she was not running in vain. She was tracing the rhythm of faith, despair followed by hope, silence broken by revelation. And today, every pilgrim who performs Sai retraces her footsteps, unknowingly echoing her courage, her fear, her unwavering belief that somewhere in the emptiness, God waits to be found. But perhaps the greater mystery lies not in the miracle itself, but in what it revealed about divine justice. God chose not a queen, not a prophet's wife, but a servant woman, an outcast, and to be the mother of a nation. In doing so, he reversed the order of human pride. He proved that favor is not bound by bloodlines or social standing, but by faith. Through Hagar, the wilderness became a throne room and the lowly became immortal. The echoes of her story stretch far beyond her lifetime. From her son Ishmael came tribes, kings, and prophets. the lineage that would one day give birth to one who would call mankind again to the worship of the one God. Every time her story is told, it whispers the same truth, that God sees the unseen and raises those who the world casts down. And yet, Hagar's story is not one of triumph alone. It is a mirror for every soul who has wandered, rejected, or broken. Each of us has known a desert, a place where we felt forgotten, unseen, unloved. But like Hagar, in those moments we discover that it is there, not in comfort but in desolation, that God speaks most clearly. His mercy flows not to the proud but to the desperate. His presence is felt most when all else is gone. The Bible tells us that after Hagar found the well, she named it Bir Lahai-Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. Those words are her eternal testimony. She did not just survive the wilderness. She transformed it. She gave it a name. She turned her suffering into sacred geography. And through her, generations learned that the desert is not a place of abandonment but of encounter. If we listen closely, her voice still speaks, not through loud proclamations but through the quiet endurance of faith. The sound of her running between two hills echoes through history, like the heartbeat of belief. She teaches us that sometimes God's miracles are not thunder and fire, but water found in the dust, hope found in despair, life born out of exile. And when we look at our world today, full of division, pride, and blindness, perhaps Hagar's tears still flow for us. For every refugee, every mother holding her child with no home to return to, every soul wandering in spiritual wilderness, her story stands as a light. It tells us that even when the world rejects us, heaven does not. That in the eyes of God, no one is invisible. In that way, Hagar's journey is more than history. It's prophecy. It reminds us that divine mercy often begins where human compassion ends. That faith is not inherited through names, but discovered through struggle. That sometimes the ones cast aside by society become the very instruments of God's plan. So when you next hear the wind whistle through a barren place, or when you face silence where you hoped for an answer, remember Hagar. Remember that the same God who found her in the wilderness watches over you. The same hand that guided her steps can guide yours, and the same tears that once fell into the sand are now the flowing waters of a sacred well, a promise that mercy never runs dry. Her story closes not with an ending, but with a beginning, the beginning of nations, of faiths, of hope reborn. Hagar's name may mean to flee, but what she found was not escape. It was destiny. Through her the desert bloomed with faith, and humanity learned one of its most enduring truths: God sees. So the next time you feel unseen, unheard, or forgotten, think of the woman who wandered under the scorching sun, with a crying child in her arms, and found eternity instead. Because somewhere out there, beyond the dunes, beyond despair, the voice still calls, "Fear not, for I have heard the voice of the child where he is." If Hagar's journey moved your heart, take a moment to reflect. Who among us has not walked through a desert of our own? Her story reminds us that faith survives even when hope seems lost, and that divine mercy often begins with a single tear. If this story touched your spirit, share it with someone who may need to hear it tonight. Subscribe to Naptime Stories for more journeys through faith, prophecy, and the hidden mysteries of Scripture. And tell me in the comments, what part of Hagar's story spoke to your soul the most?